Thanks so much, Don, and welcome.
Thank you so much. All of you probably know a little bit about Herb, and many of you may have read about how Herb would walk through the newsroom at the Post every day, showing his all but finished cartoon to selected people whose advice he wanted about whether the people looked right or whether the context was right. And his first stop was with Bob. Bob covered City Hall for the Washington Post in a very different city, covered all the biggest issues in the life of this community, and is something of an expert on the rapid change in Washington, D.C., as well as of the life of our mutual friend Herb. On behalf of all the journalists in this room, and I have to say there's something of a Washington Post alumni reunion here tonight, I think all of us want to cheer for Cal for both the great work he does in The Sun and The Economist, and for the remarks he made tonight, particularly those about freedom of expression and the threat to journalists and cartoonists around the world. He's right. And the threats, not only to people who draw, but to people who write and people who broadcast, have never been greater. If you want to do something about it, the group he mentioned, the Committee to Protect Journalists, is the most active journalism group in the United States now, unfortunately. They do a superb job all around the world, and they're very much worth all of our support. Now, they told me I could take 35 minutes from this lecture, but in a shameless bid for popularity, I will be brief. Yeah. And they also told me I could talk about any subject I wanted to talk about, but if I'm going to give the Herb Block lecture once in my life, I'm going to talk about Herb. So I am the last of the Graham family publishers. 4 of us were publishers of the Washington Post during Herb Block's time. I'm not his last publisher. His last publisher was my dear friend Bo Jones, one of the great people in the history of the paper. But Herb was a part of my childhood, a part of my upbringing. As long as I can remember, I knew that my dad, not my mom at the time, my now much more famous mother, but my dad, was engaged in trying to save and strengthen the Washington Post. And I sort of learned what was key to that. So when I was 10 years old, 1955, my father brought home a small blue book. Now, you could say that I was already quite a regular reader of the Washington Post, and that would be accurate, but it would not quite be complete. I was a regular reader of one section of the Washington Post, the one that followed the struggles of 2 of the worst teams ever to play professional sports, the Washington Senators and Redskins of the 1950s. So I learned to read on the column of a man named Shirley Povich, whom I'll talk about a little later. But from there, I moved on. I observed that the Post had a lot of great comics, and it was a fabulous day for me when we started running one called Peanuts. I little knew that I would later meet the great creator of Peanuts, Charles Schulz, waiting for Herb Block to finish his cartoon so the 2 of them could go off to dinner together, as Bob remembers. Then I noticed there was a fellow on the editorial page who was also drawing cartoons. So I was ready when the Blue Book came home, Herb Block's Here and Now. It was a little contemporary history course for a schoolboy eager to learn about the world. It was my introduction to those politicians who, to their disappointment, had caught Herb's attention in the late 1940s and early 50s. Herb was a good writer, but I suspect I read the book the way most people did. I went from cartoon to cartoon. Why had my parents thought it was worthwhile to watch this guy, Joe McCarthy, in the congressional hearings on TV? Why did we have those fallout shelter drills at school? I was a very odd 10-year-old, worshiping my father, Phil Graham, and the book was a little trip into his world. 12 years before I was born, my grandfather, Eugene Meyer, had bought the Washington Post at a bankruptcy sale. It was 1933. Mr. Meyer was a very brave and very principled guy, so principled that he'd made a fortune on Wall Street, and the reason he did not lose it in the Depression was not that he saw it coming. He was a high official in the federal government, and he thought high federal officials should not own stocks, although there were no regulations at the time. So he was in government bonds and in gold when the Depression came. He was, at the time he bought the Washington Post, he was 57 years old, and 57 in 1933 was a hell of a lot older than it is now. Most people were looking forward to retirement at that age, and while he had made a lot of money on Wall Street, he had never run a business, and he had never worked on a newspaper. The Post was losing $1 million a year. It had a claimed circulation of 50,000, and it was the fourth paper in a 5-paper town. So I knew a management consultant who was on the board of the Post when we went public in 1971. He had worked for my grandfather in 1937, 4 years after he bought the paper. And he said Mr. Meyer had told him he'd been very naive, that he believed if he made the paper better, it would sell more papers, and then advertising would follow, and he'd break even in about 3 years. Instead, he was so deep in the hole that the expenses were twice the revenues. And Warren Buffett, I later showed Warren Buffett this consultant's report, which described the books of the Post in 37 and 38. And Warren said if my grandfather had asked him his advice at the time, he'd have told him to give up. But Gene Meyer did not give up. But he kept on losing money all through the Depression and all through the war years. But in 1946, still losing about the same money, thank God he went looking for a cartoonist. So Kay Graham wrote in her memoirs that Herb's predecessor drank himself out of his job. If so, thank you. And I particularly bless Nelson Pointer, an old family friend who was the publisher of the St. Petersburg Times and the founder of Congressional Quarterly, who pointed Mr. Meyer to Herb Bloch. Herb remembered one aspect of the recruitment. Gene Meyer wanted to be comfortable with Herb, but he wanted Herb to be comfortable with the Post, too. So he sent him a mail subscription, and Herb said that gesture really meant a lot to him. So before Herb, there was exactly one writer who made people read the Post, one famous writer, which was Shirley Povich, who had become the sports columnist of the Post in 1922. And Shirley was one of the key reasons I started reading the Post so early, and he was always there. Shirley wrote 7 columns a week, and Herb did 7 cartoons a week, starting in 1947. Now, there were 2 reasons people read the Post. How closely identified was Herb Bloch with the Washington Post? Well, again, from childhood. An enormous day for my family came when, amazingly, my dad was on the cover of Time magazine. It was 1956, and I don't think I can explain this to those of you much younger than me. It was a really big deal. So on the cover was his photograph. Most of the time when you see a picture of a newspaper publisher, the background has a printing press or something from the city where the newspaper is published. The background behind my dad was dozens of Washington figures drawn by Herb Bloch. President Eisenhower, drawn as a duck, smiling as he paddled along a lake. Vice President Nixon, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, Defense Secretary Charles E. Wilson, Attorney General Herb Brownell, and others I knew then and know now only from Herb's drawings. Time noting the Post's role in keeping a Republican administration on its toes, wrote, "The Post's sharpest cut into the elephant's hide appears daily on the editorial page and in 150 other U.S. papers. The brilliant political cartoon by Herb Bloch, 46-year-old Chicago-born Herbert Lawrence Bloch, #1 U.S. cartoonist and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, this being in 1955. My dad, raised on a houseboat and who grew up on a dairy farm in a very different Dade County, Florida, said that he learned in the 1930s from Time magazine that there was a man named Hitler. It was from Herb, specifically from that blue book, that I learned that there was a senator named Joe McCarthy. From the day McCarthy raised his voice, Herb was all over him. Those cartoons packed a punch that you can't believe. And McCarthy hit back. His supporters got on the floor of Congress and called the Post the Washington edition of the Daily Worker. They were as tough could be. They circulated McCarthy's criticisms of the paper to advertising agencies and had them distribute their views to their clients. And remember, the Post was losing a lot of money at the time. Herb often graciously observed that his much acclaimed courage was real, but that the risk was more to the Post than to him. And that was true. McCarthy was a tough guy to oppose. He was alleging there were communists in the State Department or somewhere, and if you opposed him, you had to make it clear you didn't favor the communists, even though every time he opened his mouth, the number of communists in the State Department would go from 40 to 2,200 to 15 or whatnot, as Herb was continually pointing out. Making it clear that you opposed communists was not a problem for Herb Bloch. When Herb is criticized today, people tend to look at him from the perspective of Washington in 2015, but Herb's life was so different. In the 1930s, a lot of liberal Democrats in the United States had been infatuated with the Soviet Union. Some famous people like George Orwell were not. Herb was one of that handful. Unlike some of his ideological allies in the 30s, Herb had a pretty clear idea who Joseph Stalin was from the get-go. His second Pulitzer was awarded for the cartoon on Stalin's demise, in which Death, a kind of grim skeleton with a scythe on his shoulder, greets Stalin, whose sickle is dripping blood, and the caption reads, "You were always a great friend of mine, Joseph." Herb had been right about Hitler, and he had no illusions about the Russians. He was a supporter of the Korean War, the Marshall Plan, and Truman standing up to Russia. I wasn't surprised to find that in Haynes Johnson's and Harry Katz's book, published by Herb's Foundation in this library, there was a 1937 cartoon I had never seen, of course, pre-Washington Post, mocking the Stalin purge trials. The caption was, "Under the hammer and sickle," and the sickle is poised to cut off the heads of 7 tied-up prisoners. A lot of leftist Americans, including some very famous ones, were taken in by those trials, not Herb. Herb's McCarthy cartoons were hammer blows. It was one thing to write editorials, as Alan Barth did, and columns, as Joe Alsop did, about how wrong McCarthy was, but Herb made him look like a damn fool. When French cartoonists drew King Louis Philippe in the 1830s as a pear, because his face was jowly and he looked like a pear, the king had them thrown in jail and then passed a law against drawing cartoons of the king. But surely as he did those things, he knew the game was up. He knew a king who had to pass a law against cartoons was finished. At 10, Herb's cartoons seemed to be all I needed to know about Senator McCarthy, and they still do today. The wary Republican elephant is told by 4 senators that he has to stand on a rickety platform atop 11 tar barrels. The tar barrels were labeled McCarthyism. That was the first use of the word. Herb invented it. McCarthy pulls a tar-covered meat cleaver out and waves it at President Eisenhower, who has a scabbard by his side, and out of it he draws a feather. McCarthy is followed around by the ghosts of his past unproven statements, cries out, "Stop ganging up on me." The chairman of the committee investigates him, pulls down a shade over your TV screen, and the shade is labeled, "This program has been discontinued temporarily while the committee looks for a way to discontinue it permanently." What's hard to remember about the McCarthy time, but Herb made it vivid, was that it was terrifying. He showed Uncle Sam as the number 2 power in the world, the number 1 power being an offstage hand holding a whip labeled fear. Frightening was the word Kay Graham used in her book. The war between McCarthy and the Post, she wrote, was vicious and frightening. And Herb, in his book, quotes a long passage from Walter Lippmann about the damage McCarthy did to the country and how easy to forget how scary it was. My parents did not forget. McCarthy warmed Herb up for Nixon. And again, Herb saw from the start what was disturbing about him. In 1971, the year of the Pentagon Papers, I was at the Post as a reporter. A year later, I was with Kay Graham at her farm in Fauquier County, Virginia, when Howard Simons called to tell her about the Watergate burglary. In fact, he called to say there are 2 great stories we're working today. One is about a car that ran into the porch of a house, knocked down the 2nd floor, and a copulating couple fell onto the house, onto the car from above. And the other is about 5 burglars who broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate. The memories of Watergate today are preserved by the famous movie, All the President's Men. I felt when I saw it that it made much too much of the Post's role, leaving out crucial people like Judge John Sirica and Senator Sam Ervin, whose work brought much of the evidence to light. But there's 2 Post people who got left out of the movie altogether. The movie and the Post, the movie doesn't have a publisher, so Katharine Graham plays no role in the movie, and she had quite a bit to do with the story. And the other is Herb Bloch. The guy who had taught me contemporary history was at his best at that other menacing moment, and believe me, everything was at stake for that newspaper and for its publisher, Mrs. Graham. In preparation for this speech, I went back and read the first couple chapters of Woodward and Bernstein's book, All the President's Men. Their careful book, ferreting scraps of information out of totally unwilling sources, but bits had come out, only bits in the first week. The name of a White House aide in the address book of one of the burglars, some money in one of the burglars' accounts that turned out to have come from the committee to re-elect the president, a phone call to this White House aide in which Bob Woodward told him his name had turned up in that address book, and the White House aide said, "Good God." There were a few other scraps. On June 22nd, Kay Graham was walking through the newsroom, and Herb showed her the cartoon he'd prepared for the next day. It showed footsteps from the Watergate burglary going back and forth to the White House, and the caption was, "Strange, they all seem to be connected to this place." Kay said to Herb, "You're not going to run that in the paper, are you?" It ran the next day. The cartoons were a drumbeat, quite equal to the McCarthy series. Herb could jump ahead of the reporters. He could jump to conclusions which the reporters could not do. The reporters went from story to story. I will guarantee you that on June 23rd, 1972, the day that cartoon ran, no one in the Post newsroom would have believed that Watergate had the intimate connection it did to the Nixon White House. It would have been deemed impossible. But Herb had the wisdom, Herb thought ahead, and as usual, as he somehow did throughout his career, he got it just right. It was then, in that period, that Kay Graham said when she saw Herb's cartoons in the paper, she often gasped. If you want to have fun and do a little personal history into Watergate, read the first couple chapters of All the President's Men and look at Herb Bloch's special report, his book about Nixon, and look at the dates on his cartoons and how they match up to what the paper was writing. Herb was astounding. When the Pulitzer Gold Medal for Public Service was awarded to the Post, the board mentioned 4 journalists by name: Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, Bob's colleague Roger Wilkins for editorial writing, and Herb Bloch. Herb's work had amazing power and unimaginable longevity. He wasn't a kid when he came to the Post. He'd won a Pulitzer and fought in World War II, and he worked there almost 55 years. Is he the greatest cartoonist ever? For me, he is. Among American cartoonists, only Thomas Nast is his competitor, and Nast's work, great as it was concentrated in a very few years in one subject. There is the impossible competition of people like Hogarth and Daumier, fine artists who also drew cartoons, and Daumier did a 3-month jail sentence in that Pear era as a badge of honor. But Herb ranks at or near the top. It always amused me at the Post, as I thought how many reporters, how many columnists, well-known writers could get their name in the gossip column that day, but there was only one person in the building whose work was going to be looked at 100 years from now. I once expressed that sentiment in front of Herb, and he said, "Well, Don, 100 years from now, I hope people are still saying, 'Herb, that was a good one today.'" That, alas, will not happen. He will have to be content with knowing, as I think will be true, that when people in the future think, if they do, of Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon, many of them will see Herb's McCarthy and Nixon as I do. He was the greatest man I ever worked with among that great group of journalists I worked with, and I'm so grateful for the chance to talk about him. However, I want to end with a completely pointless anecdote. For only one reason. I'm telling it because even Bob and Jane Asher and the people who were closest to Herb for the longest time, and Jane, believe me, is at the head of that group, and I want to say that we terribly miss tonight Jane Record, who worked with Herb longer than anyone and whose work created this foundation and this lecture and this prize, but who will, I hope, be back next year. So not even Gene, I think, knows this story, but it was told to me by Shirley Povich, our great sports writer. And Shirley was brought to the Washington Post not as a sports writer, but as a caddy. He was brought to Washington by the publisher of the Washington Post to caddy for him. His name was Ned McLean, and he owned a private golf course on a part of Northwest Washington now known as McLean Gardens. Years of caddying made Shirley a skillful and clever golfer, but the same could not be said of his friend Herb Bloch. Shirley described Herb as possibly the worst golfer in history. But he said despite that, he loved the game and was an avid student. And when a new golf book would come out, Herb would buy it and read it and think about the plane of his elbow and the turn of his shoulders. And Herb did make one contribution to golf in Washington, D.C., and it was an important one. Long ago, when a Secretary of the Interior proposed to build something or other on the site of Herb's beloved West Potomac Park public golf course, an angry Outlook piece by Herb and his offer to play around with the Secretary of the Interior persuaded the department to save West Potomac, and all these years later, it's still there. But Herb's golf game was truly awful. So one spring day, Herb and Shirley went out together to a golf course for their first round of a brand new year. And on the way out, Herb told Shirley how much he'd been reading and how much he'd been thinking over the winter about his swing. So after Shirley hit a nice drive, Herb strode to the tee, took a careful, studied swing, and topped the ball about 10 yards in front of him. And as Shirley told the story, he put the club on his shoulder, took a long pause, looked at Shirley and said, "That Arnie Palmer is full of shit."